The studio lights burned hot that night, casting sharp shadows across the sleek set of The Andrew Brown Show. The audience buzzed with anticipation, their murmurs a low hum beneath the pulsing intro music. Barron Trump, towering at 6'7", stepped onto the stage for his first public interview, a rare glimpse into the youngest Trump, now 19 and carving his own path. His jaw was tight, his stride deliberate, exuding a quiet intensity that clashed with the host's polished grin. Andrew Brown, known for his biting wit and unapologetic prods, leaned back in his chair, ready to strike. This wasn't just an interview. It was a crucible, and everyone could feel the heat. Barron settled into the guest seat, his broad shoulders filling the frame. The crowd clapped, but their cheers felt thin, tinged with curiosity. Why had he agreed to this? Was he here to shed the shadow of his father's legacy, or to defend it? Andrew wasted no time, launching into small talk that dripped with sarcasm. Comments about Barron's height, his private life at NYU, his mother's accent. Barron nodded, his responses clipped, his eyes narrowing slightly with each jab. The host's smirk grew wider, sensing a crack to pry open. What was Barron hiding behind that stoic facade? Could he handle the spotlight, or would he crumble like so many before him? The conversation shifted, and Andrew pivoted hard. He brought up Donald Trump, not as a former president, but as a punchline. He painted a picture of a man obsessed with gold furniture and fast food, a caricature drawn from tabloid scraps. The audience tittered, but Barron's face hardened. His fingers gripped the armrests, knuckles whitening. Andrew didn't stop. He doubled down, questioning Donald's influence over Barron's choices, implying the young man was a puppet, a privileged kid coasting on a tarnished name. Wasn't it true, Andrew pressed, that Barron's whole identity was just an extension of a circus act gone stale? The crowd shifted uncomfortably, sensing the line being crossed. Barron's silence, stretched taut, a wire ready to snap. He leaned forward, his gaze locking onto Andrew's with a cold, unblinking focus. The host faltered for a split second, thrown by the sudden shift in energy. Barron didn't shout, not yet, but his presence swelled, filling the room. The audience held its breath, caught between unease and fascination. What had Andrew unleashed? Had he misjudged the quiet giant sitting across from him? The stage was set for a collision, and it was clear Barron wasn't here to play the gracious guest. Something raw and unfiltered was simmering, ready to boil over, and the night was only beginning. The air in the studio thickened as Barron's stare bore into Andrew, a silent challenge that drowned out the faint rustle of the audience. The host recovered quickly, flashing a practiced smile to mask the flicker of doubt. He leaned in, doubling, down on his attack, his voice taking on a sharper edge. He prodded at Donald's business ventures, calling them overhyped failures propped up by bravado, and then slid into personal territory, mocking the elder Trump's bombastic speeches, and even his parenting. The insinuation hung heavy. Barron was just a byproduct of chaos, a kid raised in a gilded cage with no real spine. The crowd's laughter grew uneven, some chuckling nervously while others sat stone-faced, sensing the brewing storm. Barron's jaw twitched, a subtle crack in his armor, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he shifted in his seat, his frame looming larger somehow, as if drawing strength from the insult. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, deliberate, cutting through, Andrew's rhythm like a blade. He didn't defend his father outright, not yet, but turned the tables, questioning the host's obsession with tearing people down. The audience stirred, caught off guard by the shift. Andrew blinked, thrown by the calm defiance. But he pressed on, tossing out a barb about Donald's legal battles, implying Barron must be ashamed to carry the name. That's when the dam broke. Barron's restraint shattered, and he fired back with a force that stunned the room. He called out Andrew's cheap tactics, his words laced with a raw, unpolished fury that felt years in the making. He accused the host of dragging his family through the mud for ratings, of building a career on petty jabs instead of substance. The audience gasped, some leaning forward, others shrinking back. Andrew tried to interject, his tone rising to regain control, but Barron's momentum was relentless. He stood, his height casting a shadow over the set, and the power dynamic flipped in an instant. The host scrambled, his composure slipping as Barron towered over him. The younger man's voice grew louder, rougher, each syllable a hammer strike. He didn't just defend his father. He dismantled Andrew's credibility, pointing out the hypocrisy of a man who preached authenticity while peddling scripted venom. The crowd was electric now, feeding off the chaos. Andrew's smirks faded, replaced by a tight-lipped grimace. He tried to pivot, tossing out a weak joke to lighten the mood, but it landed flat, drowned by Barron's unyielding presence. The interview was spiraling, and for the first time Andrew looked small, exposed under the weight of his own game turned against him. The studio lights seemed to flicker under the weight of Barron's shadow as he stood, his voice now a rolling thunder that silenced the room. Andrew shrank in his chair, his hands gripping the desk as if anchoring himself against the onslaught. The audience was a live wire, their gasps and murmurs fueling the tension. Barron didn't pace or gesture wildly. He didn't need to. His words alone carried a brutal precision, honed from years of watching his family dissected in public. He tore into Andrew's facade, calling the interview a sham, a rigged ambush dressed up as journalism. The host's earlier taunts about Donald were flipped back, twisted into a mirror reflecting Andrew's own desperation for relevance. Andrew tried to rally, his voice cracking as he interrupted, accusing Barron of dodging the real questions. It was a flimsy counter, and Barron pounced. He stepped closer, his frame dominating the set, and unleashed a torrent of disdain. He labeled Andrew a fraud, a bottom feeder who thrived on cheap shots because he couldn't stand toe-to-toe with anyone real. The vulgarity came then, sharp, unfiltered insults that cut deeper than any rehearsed quip Andrew could muster. The crowd erupted, some cheering, others stunned, but all riveted by the raw spectacle. Barron's rage wasn't just about defending his father. It was personal, a release of pent-up frustration at a world that had judged him before he'd even spoken. The host's face flushed, his usual swagger evaporating. He fumbled for a response, tossing out a weak deflection about Barron's temper, but it only fueled the fire. Barron leaned in, his voice dropping to a guttural snarl, and dissected Andrew's career. Every failed pilot, every canceled gig, every time he'd clawed his way back by stepping on someone else. The audience was hooked, their loyalty shifting, as Barron exposed the man behind the mic. Andrew's eyes darted to the producers offstage, silently pleading for a cut, but the cameras kept rolling. This was live TV, and he was trapped in the wreckage of his own making. Barron didn't let up. He painted a picture of Andrew as a hollow shell, a parasite who'd mistaken cruelty for cleverness. The insults grew cruder, more biting, each one landing like a punch. The host's attempts to interrupt were drowned out, his authority crumbling under Barron's unrelenting assault. By now, the set felt like a battlefield, the air thick with the stench of humiliation. Andrew's hands trembled, his smirk long, gone, replaced by a grimace of defeat. Barron stood tall, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing with a triumph that wasn't just about this moment. It was about reclaiming something bigger, something the world had tried to take from him. The studio was a pressure cooker, the aftermath of Barron's onslaught hanging heavy as he stood over Andrew, his breath steadying but his gaze still molten. The host slumped in his chair, his hands limp on the desk, the fight drained out of him. The audience was a roar now. Some shouted Barron's name, others jeered at Andrew, but all were locked in, feeding off the wreckage. Barron didn't bask in it. He straightened, his towering figure a monument of resolve, and turned the final screw. He called the show a circus, a pathetic stage for a washed-up clown, and declared he'd only come to prove one thing. He wasn't the puppet Andrew had painted him to be. The words landed like a guillotine, severing the last threads of the host's dignity. Andrew's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His eyes flickered with panic, then resignation, as the reality sank in. He'd been outmatched, outmaneuvered, and publicly gutted. Barron didn't wait for a rebuttal. He ripped off his mic, the cord snapping free with a crack that echoed through the set, and strode toward the exit. The crowd surged to its feet, a wave of applause and cheers crashing over the stage. Andrew sat frozen, a deer in the headlights of his own ruin, as the cameras lingered on his hollow stare. The producers scrambled backstage, but it was too late. The narrative had flipped, and Barron had seized it. As he reached the edge of the set, Barron paused, glancing back. Not at Andrew, but at the audience. His face softened for a split second, a flicker of something human beneath the fury, as if acknowledging the weight of what he'd just done. Then he was gone, disappearing into the wings, leaving the stage a smoldering ruin. The applause thundered on, a raw, visceral release that drowned out the show's theme music as it struggled to fade in. Andrew tried to muster a closing line, his voice a weak croak about spirited debate, but it was swallowed by the noise. The screen cut to black, the broadcast ending in chaos, but the message was clear. Barron had won. Backstage, the crew buzzed with disbelief, replaying the moment Barron had turned the tables. Andrew stayed seated, staring at the desk, the sting of humiliation etching lines into his face. He'd underestimated the quiet giant, mistaking silence for weakness, and paid the price. For Barron, it was more than a victory over one smug host. It was a declaration, a line drawn in the sand. He'd stepped out of his father's shadow, not as a defender, but as a force of his own. The audience left buzzing, their phones already lighting up with clips and reactions, the night cemented as a legend. Andrew's career would limp on, but that stage would never feel the same. Barron, meanwhile, walked away unbowed, his fury spent, his point proven, and his name ringing louder than ever.